Hollis Crane died on April 7, 1974, sitting at his kitchen table in Platte County, Nebraska, with a cup of coffee in his hand and his boots still on. Heart attack. He was 54 years old. The coffee was still warm when his son Curtis found him. The funeral was 3 days later at the Humphrey Community Church. Small service. Hollis hadn't been the kind of man who collected friends. He'd been the kind who collected observations. Quiet, watchful, the sort of man who'd stand at the edge of a field for 20 minutes, looking at dirt, while other farmers drove past in their new John Deeres and wondered what he was staring at. 31 people came to the funeral. Most of them were neighbors who felt obligated. A few were genuinely sad, and 2 of them said things at the dinner afterward at the church basement, over ham sandwiches and Jell-O salad, that Curtis Crane would carry for the next 10 years the way a man carries a bruise in a place nobody can see. The first was Gerald Hoff, who ran the Platte County State Bank. Gerald was 57, wore a brown suit that was too tight, and had the habit of talking about money in places where money shouldn't be talked about. He was standing by the coffee urn, talking to Lloyd Krause, the John Deere dealer from Columbus, when Curtis walked past, carrying plates to the kitchen. "Shame about Hollis," Gerald said, not quite quietly enough. "But between us, that 160 wasn't going anywhere with him on it, and it's not going anywhere with the boy. The soil's mediocre, the equipment's antique, and Hollis never had 2 nickels to rub together. Died the way he lived. Broke and stubborn on land that wouldn't feed a stray dog." Lloyd Krause nodded. "I tried to sell Hollis a 40-23 different times. 3 times. He looked at me like I was trying to sell him a disease. Said he didn't need it. Said the M was fine." Lloyd shook his head. "Man farmed with a 1948 Farmall M in 1974. That tells you everything you need to know." Curtis was 19. His hands were full of dirty plates. His father was in the ground 4 hours. And 2 men who had never broken a sweat on that 160 acres were standing in his dead father's church, laughing at what Hollis Crane had left behind. Curtis put the plates down. He didn't say anything. He looked at Gerald Hoff and Lloyd Krause with an expression that wasn't anger and wasn't sadness. It was something else, something quieter. Then he walked out the back door of the church, got in his father's 1966 Ford F-100, and drove 4 miles east on a gravel road to the farm where he'd been born and where his father had just died. He sat in the truck for a long time. The farm looked the same as it always had. 160 acres of flat Platte County ground, a white farmhouse that needed paint, a red barn that needed roofing, a machine shed with the door hanging crooked, and sitting in the shed, waiting like a dog that doesn't know its master is gone, was Hollis Crane's 1948 Farmall M. Curtis walked to the shed. He put his hand on the Farmall's hood. The metal was cold. It was April in Nebraska, and the wind still had teeth. He stood there in his borrowed funeral suit, black, too big in the shoulders, too short in the arms, and he spoke to the tractor the way you speak to something that knew the person you lost. "What am I going to do?" he said. The tractor didn't answer, but something else did. Now what I'm about to tell you is the part of this story that changes everything. The part that Gerald Hoff and Lloyd Krause and every man who laughed at Hollis Crane's 160 acres never knew about. The part that was hiding in plain sight for 30 years, in the one place nobody thought to look. Curtis climbed up on the Farmall M. He sat in the seat where his father had sat for 26 years, 26 springs of planting, 26 summers of cultivating, 26 falls of harvest. The seat was worn smooth. The steering wheel was polished by decades of calloused hands. The throttle lever had a groove where Hollis's thumb had rested 10,000 times. Curtis shifted his weight and felt something under the seat. Not part of the tractor, something separate, something that moved. He stood up and lifted the seat. Underneath, wedged between the seat mount and the frame, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a leather satchel, dark brown, cracked with age, held shut with a brass buckle that was green with patina. Curtis pulled it out. It was heavy. heavier than leather should be. He unclipped the buckle and opened the satchel, and what he found inside would take him 10 years to fully understand. But it would save the farm, outlast the crisis, and prove every man at that funeral dinner wrong. Inside the satchel were notebooks, 7 of them, composition books, the kind with the black and white marbled covers that cost 15 cents at the drugstore. Each one was filled, front to back, in Hollis Crane's small, precise handwriting. The first notebook was dated 1945, the year Hollis came home from the war and started farming the 160 his father had left him. The last entry was dated March 29, 1974, 9 days before Hollis died. 30 years of notes, 30 years of observations, 30 years of a quiet man recording everything he noticed about 160 acres of Nebraska soil. Let me tell you what was in those notebooks, because this is the heart of the story, and without it, nothing that follows makes sense. Hollis Crane had been doing something that no one in Platte County knew about. Not his neighbors, not the bank, not the extension agent, not even Curtis, who had farmed alongside his father since he was old enough to walk behind the planter. Hollis had been mapping his soil, every field, every corner, every rise and swale and drainage path and sand pocket and clay seam. He'd been testing it, not with a lab, but with his hands, his eyes, and a systematic method he'd developed himself. He would dig a hole, 1 foot deep, at 50-yard intervals across every field, every spring. He'd hold the soil in his hand, feel the texture, smell it, taste it. Yes, taste it, because Hollis believed you could taste the difference between living soil and dead soil, and he was right. He'd note the color, the moisture, the presence of earthworms, the smell of decomposition, and he'd write it all down. The notebooks contained hand-drawn maps of the 160 acres, not the simple plat maps you'd get from the county assessor, but detailed topographic sketches showing where the soil changed character, where the loam gave way to sand, where the clay layer was close to the surface, where water collected after a heavy rain, where the wind eroded the ridges, where the soil was dark and alive, and where it was pale and tired. And next to each map, in margins and on facing pages, Hollis had written instructions, not recipes, instructions, specific, field by field, almost acre by acre directions for how to farm that particular piece of ground. The Northwest 40. Heavy clay below 8 inches. Don't deep plow. You'll bring up hard pan. Shallow disc only. This ground holds moisture. Plant corn here in dry years. Soybeans in wet years. Never 2 years corn in a row. The clay compacts and the roots can't breathe. The Southeast 40. Sandy loam. Loses nitrogen fast. Must rotate 2 years red clover, then 1 year corn, then 1 year oats. The clover fixes 80 to 100 pounds nitrogen per acre, enough for the corn year without buying anhydrous. Spread manure here in October, not spring. Spring application on sand runs right through to the water table. The Creek Bottom 20. Best soil on the farm. Black, rich, 4% organic matter minimum. Don't touch this ground with chemicals, it's alive. Earthworm counts, 18 per shovel in 1962, 24 per shovel in 1970. This ground is getting better. Plant corn here every other year. Let it rest with clover between. This is the ground that feeds the other ground. The West Ridge 30. Wind exposed. Loses topsoil in March. Plant a windbreak. 3 rows of eastern red cedar on the north side. Until then, leave crop residue standing through winter. Never plow bare. This ground needs armor. Page after page. 30 years of learning distilled into instructions so specific that a man who'd never farmed could follow them and grow a crop. Hollis Crane, who everyone thought was just a stubborn old farmer with an antique tractor, had been conducting the most detailed independent soil study in Platte County, maybe in all of central Nebraska, for 3 decades. And he'd never told a soul. Why? Curtis asked himself that question 100 times. Why didn't his father share this? Why didn't he tell the extension agent or the Soil Conservation Office, or at least his own son? The answer was in the last notebook, the 1974 book. On the third page, dated January 12th, in handwriting that was slightly shakier than the earlier books, as if the hand that wrote it knew it was running out of time, Hollis had written a note that wasn't about soil. It was about Curtis. Curtis is 19. He thinks he knows the farm, but he knows the work, not the land. There's a difference. A man can work land his whole life and never understand it. I want him to understand it, but I can't teach it by talking. Words go in one ear and out the other with boys his age. He has to find it. He has to discover it himself, the way I did. One hole at a time, one handful at a time, one season at a time. So I'm leaving the notebooks where he'll find them when he needs them. Under the seat. He'll sit in that seat someday when I'm gone, and he'll feel the weight of what I left him. Not the land, the knowledge. The land is just dirt without the knowledge. Curtis sat on the barn floor with the satchel in his lap and cried for the first time since his father died. Not because he was sad, although he was, but because he finally understood what Hollis Crane had been doing all those years when he stood at the edge of a field and stared at dirt. He'd been reading the soil the way other men read books, and he'd been writing the textbook for his son. Now let me tell you what Curtis did with those notebooks, because this is where the story stops being about loss and starts being about proof. Curtis was 19 with a dead father, 160 acres of Farmall M, and no money. Gerald Hoff at the bank had made it clear in the church basement, over ham sandwiches, that the 160 wasn't worth financing. Curtis couldn't get an operating loan. He had no collateral beyond the land itself, and Gerald had valued it at $320 an acre, bottom of the county range, because the soil was mediocre. So Curtis did what Hollis would have done. He farmed without the bank. He had $1,800 in savings, money he'd earned baling hay for neighbors the previous summer. He used $400 for seed corn, $200 for diesel, and the rest he held back for emergencies. His total operating budget for 160 acres, $600. The county average operating cost that year was $85 per acre. Curtis spent $3.75. But here's what made the difference. He didn't farm 160 acres the same way. He farmed 4 different fields, 4 different ways, exactly as his father's notebooks instructed. The Northwest 40 got corn, shallow disked, no deep plow, planted in the heavy clay that would hold moisture through the dry June they didn't know was coming. The Southeast 40 got red clover, not corn, not soybeans, clover. Every neighbor who drove past shook his head. The Crane boys planting pasture where he should be planting cash crop. Lost his mind along with his daddy. The Creek Bottom 20 got corn, the best seed Curtis could afford. Planted in the darkest, richest soil on the farm, the soil Hollis had been building for 30 years. The West Ridge 30 got oats with standing stubble left through winter, exactly as the notebook prescribed. The first year was rough. Curtis's corn on the Northwest 40 yielded 95 bushels per acre. Decent, not spectacular. The Creek Bottom 20 did 121 bushels, well above the county average of 104. The clover on the Southeast 40 produced no cash income at all. The oats on the ridge yielded 48 bushels per acre, which he sold for $1.30 a bushel, $1,872 gross on 30 acres. Total gross revenue from 90 acres of cash crop approximately $18,000. Operating cost $600. Net $17,400. Gerald Hoff would have called it marginal. But Curtis wasn't done. He was playing a longer game, a game his father had designed, and he was only beginning to understand. Year 2, 1975. Curtis followed the notebook. The Southeast 40 stayed in clover. The clover was doing what Hollis said it would, fixing nitrogen. Red clover, left to grow for a full season, can fix 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's the equivalent of $200 to $250 worth of anhydrous ammonia for free. The soil biology was waking up. Bacteria in the root nodules were pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere and converting it into plant-available form. Earthworms were multiplying. Organic matter was climbing. Curtis dug holes that spring, just as his father's notebooks described. Same 50-yard intervals, same depth. He held the soil in his hands and felt what his father had felt, the difference between soil that's alive and soil that's just there. He started his own notebook. Same marbled composition book, same 15 cents from the drugstore. By 1976, the clover ground was ready. Curtis plowed it under in April, shallow, as the notebook instructed, and planted corn into soil that was dark, loose, and charged with nitrogen. The corn on the former clover ground yielded 138 bushels per acre. The county average was 108. 138 bushels on ground that hadn't received a single dollar of purchased fertilizer. On ground that Gerald Hoff had called mediocre. On ground that Lloyd Krause assumed couldn't produce a decent crop because the man farming it drove a 1948 tractor. Curtis did the math. 138 bushels at $2.40, $331 per acre gross. Operating cost, $6 per acre, seed and diesel only, no fertilizer. Net per acre, $325. The county average farmer, spending $85 per acre on inputs and yielding 108 bushels at $2.40, netted $174 per acre. Curtis was out-earning his neighbors by nearly double per acre. On land they called worthless. With a tractor they called junk. And he was 22 years old. Now I need to tell you about what happened next, because this is where the national story collides with Curtis's story, and the collision is what made the notebooks into something more than a family heirloom. You know the story if you've been watching this channel. October 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates. The prime rate hit 21.5% by 1981. Farm loan rates doubled overnight. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union collapsed the export market. Corn fell from $3.50 to $2.20 a bushel. Soybeans from $9 to $5.50. Nebraska farmland that had been worth $800 to $1,000 an acre started falling and wouldn't stop until it hit $300 in some counties. Between 1980 and 1988, more than 300,000 American farms were lost. More than 1,600 banks failed. Nebraska was hit harder than almost any state. Dozens of rural banks closed, and the FDIC was overwhelmed. In Platte County, the crisis was personal. 14 farms went to auction between 1981 and 1986. Every one of them had been financed through Gerald Hoff's bank or the Federal Land Bank of Omaha. Every one of them had been farmed with new equipment, high inputs, and borrowed money. Gerald Hoff's bank started to bleed in 1983. His farm loan portfolio, the loans he'd written in the 70s when land was $800 an acre and interest was 9%, was collapsing. The land was worth half what it had been. The borrowers couldn't pay. Gerald started sending foreclosure notices, then acceleration letters. Then he stopped sleeping. Lloyd Krause's John Deere dealership was dying too. New tractor sales dropped from 20 units a year to 3, then to 0. His showroom filled with repossessions he couldn't sell. The floor plan interest on his inventory was crushing him. By 1984, he'd laid off everyone except his bookkeeper. And Curtis Crane was having the best decade of his farming life. Not because the prices were good, they were terrible. Not because farming was easy, it was harder than ever. But because Curtis had 3 things that no one else in Platte County had: 0 debt, the lowest cost structure in the county, and 7 notebooks full of instructions that told him exactly how to farm every acre for maximum yield with minimum input. When corn dropped to $2.20, Curtis's numbers still worked. His costs were $8 to $12 per acre, depending on the field. His yields, because he'd been following the rotation system for 6 years, building organic matter, fixing nitrogen with clover, matching crops to soil types, were 15 to 25 bushels above the county average. At $2.20 corn, Curtis netted $180 per acre while his neighbors were losing money. He didn't expand during the boom. He didn't borrow during the bubble. He didn't buy a new tractor or a new truck or a lake house. He drove the Farmall M. He drove his father's Ford F1. He wore the same Carhartt jacket. And every month he put money in a savings account at a bank in Columbus, not Gerald Hoff's bank, because Curtis had decided on the day of his father's funeral that Gerald Hoff would never handle Crane money again. By 1985, Curtis had $94,000 in savings on 160 acres, with one Farmall M. Let me say that again. $94,000 in cash savings on 160 acres of land the banker had called worthless, with a tractor the J.D. dealer had called a museum piece. In the middle of the worst farm crisis since the Depression, in March of 1986, Gerald Hoff's bank failed. The FDIC closed the Platte County State Bank on a Tuesday morning. Gerald was 69 years old and had been in banking for 41 years. He stood on the sidewalk outside his own bank and watched the examiners change the locks. The bank's assets, including 7 foreclosed farms, were transferred to the FDIC for liquidation. Curtis heard about it at the co-op. He didn't say anything. He went home, sat at the same kitchen table where his father had died, and opened the 7th notebook, the 1974 book, the last one, the one with the note about Curtis. He read the note again. The land is just dirt without the knowledge. Then he drove to Columbus and withdrew $62,000 in cashier's checks. The FDIC liquidation auction was held in April of 1986. Curtis stood in the back, Carhartt jacket, work boots, notebook in his pocket. His own notebook now, 3 years into what would become his own 30-year record. He bought 2 parcels. The first was 80 acres adjacent to his own 160, the former Reinhardt place, which Gerald's bank had foreclosed on in 1984. Good ground, alluvial soil from the old Platte River floodplain, $340 an acre, $27,200. The second was 120 acres 2 miles south, the former Deathlifts operation, another foreclosure. Mixed soil, some clay, some sand, some good loam, $290 an acre, $34,800. Total, $62,000 for 200 additional acres. Cash, no loan. Curtis now had 360 acres, 1 Farmall M, and the notebooks. Here's what happened next, and this is the part of the story that nobody in Platte County expected. Curtis applied his father's method to the new ground. He spent the first season walking every foot of the 200 new acres, digging holes at 50-yard intervals, feeling the soil, tasting it, smelling it, recording everything in his own notebook. He mapped the new fields the way Hollis had mapped the original 160. Not with instruments, but with hands and patience and time. He found that the Reinhardt 80 had been corn on corn for 8 years straight. The organic matter was 1.4%. The soil was gray and compacted. No earthworms. The ground was, in the language of Hollis's notebooks, tired. He put the entire Reinhardt 80 into red clover. For 2 years. No cash crop. No income from those acres. People thought he was insane. Curtis Crane just bought 80 acres of good ground and planted clover on it, they said at the co-op. That boy's going to lose everything his daddy left him. But Curtis had the notebooks, and the notebooks said what they'd always said. Clover first, then corn. Build the soil, then harvest the soil. You can't take from ground what you haven't put into it. 2 years later, 1988, Curtis plowed the clover under on the Reinhardt 80 and planted corn. The yield, 142 bushels per acre, on ground that had been producing 88 under the previous owner, a 61% increase, with 0 purchased fertilizer. The county extension agent, a man named Frank Lube, drove out to Curtis's farm to see for himself. He'd heard the numbers and didn't believe them. "How are you getting 142 out of ground that was doing 88? Frank asked. Curtis didn't say much. He handed Frank a shovel and walked him to the middle of the Reinhardt field. "Dig," Curtis said. Frank dug a hole, 12 inches deep. The soil was black, loose. It smelled like a forest floor. There were earthworms. Frank counted 16 in a single shovel blade. "This was corn on corn for 8 years before I bought it," Curtis said. The man who farmed it was spending $120 an acre on anthracite and still only getting 88 bushels. "I spent nothing on fertilizer and got 142. You want to know why?" He pulled the notebook out of his back pocket. Not Hollis's notebook, his own. He showed Frank the entries for the Reinhardt 80, the soil observations, the organic matter estimates, the clover rotation plan. "My father taught me this, not in words. He left me notebooks, 30 years of soil observations. He mapped every acre of our home farm and told me exactly how to farm each piece of it. I'm doing the same thing with the new ground." Frank Luby stood in that field for a long time. Then he asked if he could see the original notebooks. Curtis took him to the barn, showed him the satchel, showed him the 7 composition books with the marbled covers. Frank sat on a hay bale and read for 2 hours while Curtis did chores. When Frank came out of the barn, his eyes were different. "Curtis," he said, "your father was doing soil science, real soil science, field-level, observation-based, longitudinal soil science, without a degree, without a lab, without funding, for 30 years. This is extraordinary." "It's not data," Curtis said, "it's farming." Frank asked if he could share the notebooks with the agronomy department at the University of Nebraska. Curtis said yes, but on one condition: the notebooks stayed on the farm. Anyone who wanted to read them could come to the barn. Over the next 3 years, 11 researchers, 6 extension agents, and more than 40 farmers came to Curtis Crane's barn to read Hollis Crane's notebooks. They sat on hay bales and upturned buckets and read the handwritten observations of a man who'd been dead for 15 years. And they learned things that contradicted what they'd been taught in classrooms and sold by fertilizer companies. That rotating clover through sandy soil could eliminate the need for purchased nitrogen. That matching crop selection to soil type, field by field, not blanket planting the whole farm, could increase yields by 20 to 40%. That deep plowing clay ground destroys structure and reduces yields. That soil is alive, and treating it like a chemical substrate instead of a biological system is the fastest way to kill it. Hollis Crane had known all of this. He'd figured it out by himself, one hole at a time, one handful at a time, one season at a time, and he'd written it down in 15-cent notebooks and hidden them under a tractor seat for his son to find. Now here's the ending, and it's the part I carry with me. In 1991, the county held an agricultural achievement dinner at the Humphrey Community Center. Curtis was invited to speak. He was 36 years old. He farmed 360 acres. He owed nothing. His yields were the highest in the county, and he'd done it all with a system invented by a man who everyone said died broke. Curtis stood at the podium in a clean shirt, not a suit, never a suit, and he held up one of the composition books. The marbled cover, the 15-cent price tag still faintly visible. "My father, Hollis Crane, died in 1974, Curtis said. At his funeral, 2 men said he died broke and stubborn on land that wouldn't feed a stray dog. One was a banker, one was a JD dealer. The banker's bank failed in 1986. The dealer's shop closed in 1985. My father's farm is still here." The room was silent. "My father left me 160 acres, a Farmall M, and these notebooks, 7 of them, 30 years of soil observations, maps, rotations, instructions for every field on the farm. He hid them under the tractor seat because he wanted me to find them myself. He knew that if he just told me, I wouldn't listen, so he wrote it down and trusted the tractor to deliver it." Curtis paused. "The men who laughed at my father's funeral were the same men who told every farmer in this county to borrow more, buy bigger, and trust the market. My father didn't trust the market. He trusted the soil, and the soil didn't let him down. Not once. Not in 30 years. He held up the notebook. This cost 15 cents. The advice inside it has earned this farm over $1 million in 18 years. The John Deere dealer tried to sell my father a $15,000 tractor 3 times. My father's $2,000 Farmall M and his 15-cent notebook outperformed every piece of equipment on every farm in this county. Not because the tractor was better, because the man driving it understood what he was driving over. Curtis looked out at the audience. Farmers, their wives, a few bankers from the surviving banks, the county extension agent, 40 people who had been through hell and were still standing. My father wasn't broke. He was the richest man in this county. He just kept his wealth where bankers can't count it and dealers can't sell it. He kept it in the soil, and he left it to me in a leather satchel under a tractor seat. He closed the notebook. If your father or grandfather left you something, a way of doing things, a warning about debt, a piece of wisdom about the land, don't ignore it. Don't laugh at it. Don't trade it for a bigger tractor and a bigger loan. Write it down. Put it somewhere safe and pass it on. Standing ovation. Every person in the room on their feet, some wiping eyes, because half of them had known Hollis Crane, and half of them had thought exactly what Gerald Hoff had said at the funeral, and now they knew how wrong they'd been. Curtis Crane farmed until 2011. He was 56 when he handed the operation to his daughter Elaine and his son Hollis Jr., named after the grandfather. Neither of them had met, but both of them knew through the notebooks. By 2011, the original 160 had grown to 640 acres, all purchased with cash from farming profits, all debt-free. The organic matter on the home farm's creek bottom was 5.2%, approaching virgin prairie levels. The Farmall M was still on the property. Curtis had parked it in the barn in 2003, when the hydraulic pump finally gave out after 55 years of service. He refused to scrap it. That tractor carried my father's notebooks for 26 years, he said. It's earned its rest. The satchel sits on a shelf in the barn. The 7 notebooks are inside it, wrapped in the same oilcloth. Elaine started her own notebook in 2012. Hollis Jr. started his in 2013. The composition books still cost less than $1. And every spring before planting, the Crane family walks the fields the way Hollis did, digging holes, holding soil, smelling it, feeling it, recording what they find in 15-cent notebooks that contain more knowledge about 640 acres of Nebraska ground than any satellite or computer or soil lab will ever match. Because the land doesn't speak to screens. It speaks to hands, and the hands have to be listening. Sometimes the richest man in the county looks the poorest. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't land or money, it's a notebook. And sometimes the man they buried and laughed at is the one whose voice echoes loudest 30 years after the last word he ever wrote. Hollis Crane's funeral was attended by 31 people. His notebooks have been read by hundreds. His methods feed 640 acres. His grandson carries his name, and his Farmall M still sits in the barn where he left it. Seat lifted, satchel gone, delivered.